As songwriters, we're always looking for new and interesting ways to create music. And today I want to show you one of the best methods I've found for breathing life into your creative process. So in this video, I'm going to talk to you about adding a little chromatic magic to your songwriting. And we're going to focus on how to write killer riffs, ear-grabbing melodies, and some really interesting chord progressions. This will be part one of a two-part video series, and in this video I'm going to talk primarily about single note lines, melodies, riffs. In part two, we're going to focus on chord progressions and chordal movement and all the different ways chromaticism can help your songwriting process by giving you new ideas and variations to play with. Now, one of the biggest challenges facing any composer or songwriter is that we fall into repetitive patterns, predictable patterns. And this happens for a really good reason. If we spend any considerable amount of time practicing scales, arpeggios, chord sequences, it would make sense that we would develop a certain amount of muscle memory around those moves. And what also happens is that our ears become very used to those sounds. Our ears start to hear those patterns and want to hear more of those patterns. And so we find those patterns popping up in our songwriting and our compositions over and over. And this is when we can get a little bit stale and a little bit stuck. And one way we can address this problem is to find ways of deliberately breaking these patterns, both physically on our instrument of choice and breaking the patterns that we've become accustomed to in our ears. This is where chromaticism can be a huge help. Chromaticism comes from the Greek word chroma, meaning color. And so when we introduce chromaticism into our process, what we're really doing is introducing new colors to our palette, introducing new sounds and new textures to our repertoire, so we don't find ourselves getting stuck doing the same old thing every time. Now, what I'm going to show you began as a warm-up exercise on guitar and a way to practice finger independence. And whilst I'm showing you on guitar, and this is going to be very valuable for guitarists, it applies to many other types of instruments. And so whatever instrument you play, find a variation of this exercise that works for you, knowing that the focus is to break the patterns that have become familiar to us. And so the exercise goes like this. We take the first 4 frets of the guitar neck, placing one finger per fret, creating a strong sense of finger independence, creating even tone, good timing. And so the exercise itself is really all about technique and connecting with your instrument. But as you'll see, we're going to do something completely different with it in a minute and use it as a way to generate some fantastic ideas and very creative ideas for our riff writing, our melody making, and lines that we may use when improvising. So to start the exercise, we simply play the sequence 1, 2, 3, 4 with each of our fingers all the way across the neck. And then the idea is that you would come back. Simple enough, right? Now, that's great in terms of just doing a quick warm-up, getting the fingers going. But what I started to discover was I was on autopilot doing that. And you very quickly become on autopilot when any pattern becomes familiar with the fingers. And so then it's a matter of just speeding it up. And we're not thinking about it, we're just doing it. So here's where it gets interesting, because this is where we can start to disrupt the pattern. This is where we can break it down and actually get our brains to start processing some new combinations of notes. And it's quite simple. We take the number sequence 1, 2, 3, 4 and we randomize it, or we organize those 4 notes in a different order. So what if we were to say 2, 3, 1, 4? And we go back. And towards the end, it was starting to feel, more comfortable. It naturally gets more comfortable as you would expect it to. So then we change up the pattern again. What if we said 3, 4, 2, 1? And for each of these new patterns, you're working, you're thinking. But what's really important here is that there are 2 key benefits. The first is that my fingers, given that I write mostly on guitar, my fingers are now becoming familiar with new shapes, new patterns. And so I'm adding to the repertoire of what feels familiar under my hand. But the other thing that's happening is my ear is becoming more accustomed to some of these new sounds. And whilst they sound a little bit weird and a little bit twisted, it's introducing some more options that I may just pull out at specific moments during a song or a composition. If we now take this a step further, one of the things we can do is say, let's introduce some diagonal movement into the picture. So what if I were to start on the 4th string, play it linearly, strictly chromatic, and then go diagonally, and then up chromatically on the top string. I could then reverse that pattern by moving up a semitone, and so we get this kind of spidery pattern that moves up the neck. And whilst that sounds very much like a chromatic exercise, which it is, again, we get to now break that pattern. And so instead of saying 1, 2, 3, 4, why don't we go 1, 2, 4, 3? Then do a little leapfrog. And I had to think about it there as I got to the top string. And so now if I do that again, and it may sound like nothing that you would use in a pop song, and you wouldn't expect to use that entire phrase in any particular context, except maybe in a piece of film score or experimental music. But having finger independence and having new sounds that we can draw on so that we're not always stuck in the old patterns becomes incredibly useful, especially when we're coming up with lines. And you hear this in the blues a lot. So if we're playing a G blues, you would hear a lot of blues players use chromaticism, not just in the blues scale, which has the chromatic run between the 4 and the 5, sharp 4 in the middle. But there are other notes we can use, say between the flat 7 and the 5, or even from the root down to the flat 7. So you would hear things like this. Or perhaps leaning more on that minor sound. And so all that's great for improvising and playing the blues. But what about writing riffs? Because this is where a chromatic approach can be really, really helpful. And we hear this in some very famous riffs. And one of those very famous riffs from a very famous metal band is Master of Puppets by Metallica. Such a great use of chromaticism because we've got this high energy, very aggressive kind of E minor riff. And then there's the response. That's the call part. That's part 1. Part 2 is. And we hear this in almost every genre. Metal has a lot of it in the riffs. You have a lot of it in jazz, a lot of it in blues, and some of the most iconic and memorable melodies in our musical history have lent on this chromatic approach. If we think of the James Bond theme, which is really using what's called a line cliche, but the riff, that very famous, unmistakable riff, so when I'm writing a song and starting with a riff, I'm often looking for these opportunities, and I'll give you an example. Here's one that's really just moving back and forth between 2 chords to begin with. Starting on the A major, moving down to the F sharp minor, the relative minor. And I want it to have, you know, this driving kind of pulse. So I want it to go. Which is a nice pulse, but to give it a little bit more interest, I've added in a little side slip move, which is a little semitone move between two notes. It's a quick move, but you can hear that it brings the riff to life in a far more interesting way. 2, 3, 4. And so that riff, as I was writing it, felt like the verse. It felt appropriate to just stay between those two chords, introduce that little side slip move. And then I thought, well, what's the chorus going to be? And how can I keep this sound going? How can I keep this chromatic approach going throughout the song? And so what I ended up with was this. 2, 3, 4. And you can see all the little chromatic runs there. Sometimes just 3 notes, but that's all you need. And so then you get this when you add it all together. 2, 3, 4. It felt very appropriate that once I'd started that chromatic approach with the verses, I carry it on through the chorus. And for me, it just livens up what would otherwise be a fairly stale and static sounding chord progression. So this is what we can do with a chromatic approach. This is what adding a little chromatic magic to your formula can do. It takes what would sometimes be a very predictable or uninteresting kind of sound, and it adds this little injection of color to it. It takes it from being something that we've heard before to something that we haven't. In the next video, which will be part 2 of this mini-series, I'm going to show you all the different ways we can apply chromaticism to chord movements and chord progressions. So until then, happy songwriting. Bye for now.